To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
In 1991, a 55-year-old woman was brutally assaulted and tortured inside her Pennsylvania apartment. Investigators quickly focused on a former maintenance worker who knew the building well, John Kunco. There was no DNA evidence linking him to the crime. Still, John was convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. Years later, his original conviction would be overturned. This is Forensic Tales, episode 312, The Story of John Kunco. In the U.S., more than 3,500 people have been exonerated after being wrongfully convicted, many of them after spending decades behind bars. They miss out on important family events. They don't get to see their children grow up. They miss birthdays, weddings. They sit in prison for a crime they didn't commit. Some of these wrongful convictions involve forensics. According to the Innocence Project, faulty forensic evidence plays a role in nearly 1/4 of those cases. One of the most controversial forms of that evidence is bite mark analysis, a topic we've covered on the show before. We all know the Ted Bundy case. A big part of his conviction came from bite mark testimony. And in that case, they got it right. He's responsible for killing at least 20 people. But what happens when that same analysis gets it wrong? Since DNA exonerations began, bite mark testimony has been linked to dozens of wrongful convictions, despite repeated scientific warnings about its unreliability. Some might even say it's junk science and has no place in the courtroom at all. It's just as reliable as, let's say, polygraphs. They might be useful as an investigative tool, but they aren't good enough to convict someone of a crime. Others argue, despite its issues, it's still reliable forensic evidence that can prove someone's guilt in a crime. It might not be as good as DNA or fingerprints, but it's still science. But, again, what happens when bite mark analysis goes wrong? What if it were your loved one on trial, and the only evidence against them involved bite analysis? Is that enough for a conviction? Well, in 1991, that kind of evidence helped send a Pennsylvania man, John Kunco, to prison. But this isn't your typical wrongful conviction. Today, there are still so many unanswered questions about whether he was actually innocent or not. At the end of the episode, I'll let you decide if he was wrongfully convicted or just got wrapped up in a crime with bad forensic evidence. In the early morning hours of December 16, 1990, a 55-year-old woman named Donna Seaman woke up in her Pennsylvania apartment to find a man standing in her bedroom. It was still dark. She couldn't clearly see his face. To better put this situation into context, Donna was visually impaired, blind in one eye and farsighted in the other. And on this particular night, she wasn't wearing her glasses. So you can already imagine that she's an incredibly vulnerable victim here. Almost instantly, the man threatened her, saying he had a knife and he wasn't afraid to use it. So all she could really do was comply and do whatever he asked her to. She didn't have time to think about anything. Next, he blindfolded her, making it impossible for her to see what was happening or who was attacking her. Unless you've been in a situation like this, you just can't imagine how terrifying that must have been. What followed next was a prolonged and brutal assault that lasted for hours. Most of what happened is just too graphic to explain in detail. But here's the big picture. the attacker moved her throughout the apartment, physically restraining her, beating her, and repeatedly sexually assaulting her. At one point, he used objects from inside the apartment to further torture her, including an electrical cord, something we'll talk about later in the episode. It just doesn't get any more sicker and twisted than that. At some point during the incident, Donna felt what she believed was a bite to her shoulder, a detail that would later become central to the prosecution's case. Eventually, the attacker lay down beside her in bed for a period of time before assaulting her again and finally leaving the apartment. Then once she was all alone, Donna managed to free herself from the restraints. She then ran into the hallway yelling for help, and within minutes, a neighbor found her and called police. The entire ordeal was finally over and help was on the way. She somehow physically survived all of this. By the time police showed up, Donna was severely injured. She was traumatized. She just went through the worst possible thing any human ever could. And as a result of that trauma, she had a hard time explaining what had happened. But she was alive. And investigators were already beginning to search for the person responsible. The Pennsylvania State Police took charge of the investigation, and right away, they processed the apartment from top to bottom. They searched for anything that might help them identify the attacker. But it wasn't a very good crime scene when it came to the forensic evidence. They started by looking for fingerprints, but they weren't able to find any. None of the prints recovered from the scene could be used for comparison. They also collected other physical evidence from the apartment and from Donna Seaman herself. This included her bedding, her clothing, and a sexual assault kit. Donna hadn't had consensual sex in the days leading up to the attack, so the police felt confident that detail might help them narrow down a suspect pool. As they documented her injuries at the hospital, they photographed what they believed to be a bite mark on her shoulder. But here's the first problem with it. No actual measurements of it were taken, and the area itself was never swabbed for saliva or DNA. The only thing they did was take some photos of it. In today's world, these are basic practices. They would have swabbed the mark for DNA. They would have taken comparison measurements of it. It would have been a much bigger deal, but in this case, that's all they did. While still hospitalized and heavily traumatized, Donna was interviewed by police. Of course, the police needed to get her side of the story, but maybe it was a little too soon to speak with her. Maybe they should have waited a little longer to get her interview. Either way, she was interviewed within hours of the attack. And during their conversation, she told detectives that the attacker's voice sounded familiar. She said it sounded like a, quote, John, who had previously worked in her apartment building as a maintenance worker. She was so sure that the voice she heard was John's. But it makes you wonder, did she actually remember that detail? Or did she feel pressured by police to give them a clue? It was only after the police kept questioning and questioning her that she said it sounded like the maintenance worker. But that wasn't the only detail she shared with investigators. She was also able to provide them a description. She said he was tall, had a beard, and he was wearing a hat at the time of the attack. But it's important to mention here that at the time, she didn't specifically name John Kunco. And during an earlier interview with police, she didn't identify him as her attacker. All she said was that she thought she recognized the guy's voice. That was it. 2 days later, detectives were back at Donna's hospital bedside. This time, one of them attempted to imitate what he believed the attacker's voice sounded like, including a lisp. And after hearing this officer's imitation, that's when she began to believe the voice belonged to John Kunco, someone who spoke with a lisp. John was also someone who worked in her apartment building as a maintenance worker, so she would have recognized him, and he would have had access to her apartment. It was only after that interaction, days after the assault, that her identification shifted from uncertain to specific. Over the next few weeks, police also gathered statements from some of Donna's neighbors in the apartment building. And after speaking with one of the neighbors, they got what they believed to be an important clue. One neighbor said she overheard John Kunco make a sexually suggestive remark at a Christmas party that happened weeks before the assault. But did that remark ever really happen? And what did it have to do with what happened here? Well, according to this one neighbor, it did, but according to other people who were at this Christmas party, it didn't happen. For police, it just gave them more fuel to the fire. They didn't need to look for other suspects, so whatever tips they got about him, they thought it made him look guilty. So at this point, police feel pretty good that they have their suspect. Victim identified his voice as police imitated him. He had access to her place as the maintenance guy. So that explains why there weren't any signs of forced entry and how he was so easily able to get inside her bedroom. It all makes sense to detectives, but what, if any, physical evidence did they have linking him to the crime? Other than the alleged bite mark on Donna's shoulder, no physical evidence connected him to the crime scene. And when I say no physical evidence, here's what I mean. Lab testing on the sexual assault kit didn't reveal the presence of semen, and the blood found under the victim's fingernails was consistent with her own, not her attackers. Several reddish hairs were found on Donna's bed where the assault occurred, but those hairs didn't match either Donna or John Kunco. In fact, based on hair comparison analysis at the time, John was excluded as the source of those foreign hairs. Even worse, despite that exclusion, no DNA testing was ever performed on any of the evidence collected. Not the bedding, not the hairs, and not the sexual assault kit. So there's no question that the crime was violent and real, but the forensic evidence didn't place John Kunco inside the apartment that night. But despite all of this, the police felt good about him being their primary suspect. When it came to an alibi, John told police he was at home in bed with his girlfriend and their infant child, and even the girlfriend seemed to support that. She said that every time she woke up to feed the baby, John was there asleep. So there was no way he could have left to go commit this crime. But the detectives didn't buy it. He was eventually arrested on rape charges in January 1991, and the case against him relied on two things. Number one, an alleged bite mark found on the victim's shoulder, and number two, the victim's belief that she recognized his voice after police imitated the attacker's speech. Neither one are very good or reliable pieces of information to convict someone of one of the worst possible crimes. To examine the bite mark, the Commonwealth hired a forensic odontologist, Dr. Michael Sobel. And the problem was the photograph itself. There was no scale in the image, meaning the size of the injury couldn't be measured or reliably compared to anyone's teeth. All they could do was look at the image, then look at someone's teeth, and say whether they were a match or not. There was no actual measurement. Even worse, Dr. Sobel and a colleague, Dr. Thomas David, believed they could still reach conclusions using a technique involving ultraviolet light, a method they claimed could reveal bite marks not visible to the naked eye. But wait, things get even worse. The first time these two odontologists hired by the Commonwealth examined Donna's shoulder, that was 5 months after the attack. They didn't look at it within hours, or even days. They looked at it 5 months later, and by then, the injury had completely healed. There weren't even any visible marks left to analyze. They just had a photograph with no scale. Before conducting the exam, the odontologists reviewed the case file, including police reports describing the assault and identifying John Kunco as the suspect. Then, using ultraviolet light, They claimed they could still see a faint pattern on her shoulder, a pattern they described as consistent with a human bite. They then took a hand-drawn outline of John Kunco's teeth and placed it over the ultraviolet image. Based on that comparison alone, the odontologists concluded that John's teeth were the source of the bite mark and that no one else could have made it. This conclusion would become the most powerful piece of evidence presented to the jury, and it would later be at the center of why the conviction didn't stand. It's a new year and time to get back to feeling like yourself. If losing weight is one of your 2026 goals and you're ready to make progress you can count on, then Weight Loss by Hers might be the right fit for you. Through Hers, you're connected with a medical provider who determines if treatment is right for you. If prescribed, your treatment plan is personalized to support you in reaching your goals. Plus, you can access a range of treatment options like oral medication kits or GLP-1 injectables. They even offer the convenience of completely online care with licensed providers on the other side who learn your story and create a personalized plan to deliver healthy progress you can maintain. These are results you can count on. Feel like your best self again? Visit forhers.com/tales to get a personalized, affordable plan that gets you. That's forhers.com/tales, forhers.com/tales. Weight loss by Hers is not available everywhere. Compounded drug products are not approved or evaluated for safety, effectiveness, or quality by the FDA. Prescription required. See website for full details, important safety information, and restrictions. Actual price depends on product and plan purchased. Both of these forensic odontologists took the stand for the Commonwealth at John's trial. They told the jury they were confident, to what they called a reasonable degree of dental certainty. The bite mark on Donna Seaman's shoulder had been made by John Kunco's teeth. Period. Full stop. And in the eyes of the jury, that was very powerful testimony. These were two very respected odontologists, and if they were certain it was John's bite mark, who were they to disagree with them? Expert testimony at trial, especially when it comes to forensic experts, that can be very, very powerful, especially for the Commonwealth. In response, John took the stand in his own defense. He testified that at the time of the attack, he was at home with his girlfriend and their baby. They even had the girlfriend take the stand and tell jurors that he was home all night and there was no way he could have left without her knowing. The defense also presented testimony from the victim's landlord, who was also John's former boss. He told the jury that he spoke with John over the phone during the exact window when the attack was taking place. He had even kept handwritten notes documenting the time, date, and details of that phone call. So that sounds like a pretty good alibi, right? Well, despite that testimony, the jury was faced with two competing narratives, one rooted in witness testimony and records, and the other anchored by forensic experts who claimed scientific certainty. In the end, the jury believed the science. He was found guilty of rape, involuntary sexual intercourse, and aggravated assault. And with that guilty verdict came a very harsh sentence: 45 to 90 years in prison. From the start, John maintained his innocence. He said he didn't commit this awful, awful crime. He wasn't perfect. In fact, he'd been convicted of a few crimes over the years. But this wasn't something that fit his MO. Before this, he was a new dad and just trying to support his family. What motive would he have to break into this woman's apartment and assault her like that? Especially on a night where his girlfriend said he never left the house and his boss spoke with him over the phone at the same exact time. Over the next decade, he did everything he could to get out of prison. But all of those attempts, including a PCRA petition and a habeas corpus petition, they were all unsuccessful. So for the next several years, John sat in prison. He became yet another person trapped in a system that is very hard to get out of. It wasn't until 2009, when the Innocence Project got involved, that there was some movement in the right direction. In 2009, the Post-Conviction Relief Act Court, or PCRA Court, finally granted his motion for post-conviction DNA testing. The Innocence Project specifically wanted the lamp cord that had been used to torture the victim to be tested for DNA. And here were the results of that testing. The lab that did it, Cellmark Laboratories, concluded that John Kunco was excluded as the source of the DNA found on the cord. His DNA wasn't on it. It belonged to an unknown male. Yes, it showed that John's DNA wasn't on a key piece of evidence collected from the crime scene, but it wasn't enough to get him released from prison. Right after these findings were made public, John's attorneys asked the court to overturn his conviction, but that request was denied. The court ruled that, despite the DNA exclusion, the remaining evidence against him was still compelling. They specifically pointed to the bite mark testimony, the victim's voice identification, and that statement he allegedly made at the Christmas party. So even with DNA evidence excluding him from a key piece of physical evidence, John Kunco remained in prison. The science just wasn't enough to outweigh what the jury had heard years earlier. Fast forward another 7 years. In April of 2016, the two forensic dentists who had testified at the trial submitted a joint affidavit to the court. In it, they acknowledged that although their testimony had followed what was considered acceptable practice in 1991, they no longer stood by their original conclusions. They specifically withdrew their claim that John Kunco was the person who made the bite mark. But why the sudden change of heart? They testified in front of that jury that they were sure about their findings. Well, their change in position came after the American Board of Forensic Odontology updated their standards. Under the new guidelines, experts are no longer allowed to make individual identifications based on bite marks. In other words, forensic dentists can no longer say that a specific person made a specific bite mark, only that someone may or may not be excluded. At one of the court hearings, Dr. Thomas Davis testified that under the updated guidelines, his opinion in John's case would have to be different, and he wasn't alone. Other forensic dentists also testified on John's behalf, including the sitting president of the American Board of Forensic Odontologists. They all pointed to growing research, including findings from the National Academy of Sciences, showing that bite mark analysis lacks scientific reliability and should not be used to identify suspects in criminal cases. But this still wasn't the end of the story. Just 1 month later, in May of 2016, the Innocence Project filed a new post-conviction petition asking the court for additional DNA testing on more evidence from the scene. Before it was the lamp cord, now it was a blanket, the girdle used to blindfold the victim, and the original rape kit. They essentially argued that modern DNA technology could detect biological material that earlier testing had missed, like semen, skin cells, or even hair. And this testing could potentially identify the real attacker. They also asked for a full, documented search of police and laboratory evidence storage to locate all remaining evidence connected to the case, including items last known to be in the possession of local and state law enforcement. February 21st, 2017, the PCRA court ordered the DNA testing over the Commonwealth's objection. And just like before, the testing identified a single source of unknown male DNA on the blanket. It didn't belong to John and was consistent with the male DNA that had been found earlier on the lamp cord. This discovery was what finally helped John Kunco gain his freedom back. On May 23, 2018, a court in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, vacated John's 1991 rape conviction. But the order didn't mean he would walk completely free. This decision only meant that the original conviction was vacated due to faulty forensic evidence. He would still face a second trial. By that point, he had spent 28 years in prison for a crime he says he didn't commit. Without question, the court's decision corrected the record, but it couldn't give John back the years he lost, if in fact he really is innocent. In an interview with the Innocence Project, he described what it was like to walk free after 28 years. He also talked about what it was like to leave his baby girl behind. Here are some of those interview questions. What was life like before you were wrongfully convicted? I had my own business as a metal refinisher. I also did plastering and painting on the side. I loved coming home from work every day to see my family. It felt good. Then it just disappeared. My daughter Lauren was born on July 3rd, 1990. If she had been born 2 minutes earlier, she would have been born on my birthday. How old was your daughter when you were wrongfully convicted? She was 6 months old. The last time I saw her before I was released, she was 5. How did you feel about leaving her behind? It hurt. I went through a lot the first couple of years. I ended up in the hospital for 9 months. I was lost. I just gave up. It was like they took my world away from me. Eventually, Lauren stopped coming to visit. That's when I woke up and said, I can't just lay here and act like nothing happened. I have to fight. And that's when I started fighting. Did you and Lauren ever reconnect while you were incarcerated? When Lauren's older stepbrother died, she called the prison to let me know. That was the first time I had talked to Lauren since she was 5 years old. At that time, she was 21. We talked for 6 years on the phone before we actually met. The best thing about it was that when Lauren first called, my unit manager and counselor knew I hadn't spoken to her in years. So they told her, anytime you want to talk to your father, you can call us here and we'll go get him. That was wonderful. Lauren started to call every week. If it weren't for my unit manager and counselor, I don't think we would have known each other as well as we do now. One question often comes up in cases like this. What happened next? Well, what happened next might surprise you. Within just hours of John's release from prison, he was charged with having improper contact with a child. He was accused of having a minor over at his apartment sometime shortly after his release. These charges came down just hours after he got his conviction vacated in this case. In that case, he pleaded guilty to a reduced misdemeanor charge of indecent assault against an unconscious person and was sentenced to serve 5 years on probation. He was also required to register as a convicted sex offender for the next 25 years. When it came to the 1990 case, here's another surprising twist. In August of 2019, he did something I don't think anyone expected. He agreed to plead guilty to reduced charges in order to avoid a second criminal trial. He agreed to plead guilty to aggravated assault, unlawful restraint, terroristic threats, and burglary. And for those crimes, the judge sentenced him to a 14 to 28-year prison sentence, which he had already completed. So it was essentially credit for time served. However, according to the Innocence Project, that doesn't mean he's guilty. They still say he was wrongfully convicted of the crime, but faced with a second trial, they say John just couldn't risk losing his freedom again. Unfortunately, the risk of reconviction and returning to prison for a crime he did not commit was not one he could assume, the Innocence Project said in a statement. Now, for another stat. According to the Innocence Project, 18% of known exonerees pleaded guilty to crimes they did not commit. So, did John simply plead guilty because he knew he would be sentenced to credit for time served? And if he rolled the dice and went to trial a second time and got convicted, what would happen then? Or was it just easier to plead guilty and maintain his freedom? Well, no one will ever have the answer to those questions. It's hard to say whether prosecutors would have been successful at a second trial. The victim in this case has passed away, and so has the original lead detective. Plus, all the DNA evidence at the scene points to a third-party culprit. So, I guess we will never know how that second trial would have turned out. John Kunco's original conviction has been erased, but the questions surrounding the case remain. And in another tragic turn, John didn't have much time to live as a free man. He passed away in August of 2025 at the age of 60 after a battle with cancer. Cases like this force us to ask not just who committed a crime, but how confidently and carefully we claim to know the answer. Because in forensic science, the difference between possibility and proof can mean the difference between justice and injustice.
Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com.
If you enjoy the show, please consider leaving us a positive review. Make sure you're subscribed to the show so you don't miss an episode.
Thank you for listening, and see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.